Thank you for attending this breakout session. It's a privilege to be here and a great opportunity to share some of the exciting ongoing stuff happening in artificial intelligence at Dana-Farber, and also present a vision for what we'd like to do going forward and how we'd like to engage with you all in this room in the same vein with which we engage with all the folks at the Farber across the institution to do this kind of research writ large. So as a way of sort of initial formal introduction, my name is Ellie Van Allen. I'm a medical oncologist in the genitourinary cancer division led by Dr. Tony Shueri, who's in this room. And I'm also the chief of a division called Population Sciences at Dana-Farber, as well as an associate professor at Harvard Medical School. And I've been tasked with sort of the provocative title of Artificial Intelligence is Here, What Does It Mean for Patients? And I thought what I would do before jumping into the topic at the forefront is actually rewind a little bit, explain how folks like me ended up sort of in positions to tell you all about this, and then lead you into sort of where things are at and where we think things can go in the future. So by way of a sort of a slightly less formal introduction, so again, I'm Ellie, and there's a picture of me. This is actually from 4th grade. I'm from Los Angeles originally. This was me out in elementary school, and I remember very vividly being extremely bored as a student in elementary school up until a very pivotal day in 4th grade when they brought an Apple IIe computer and put it into our classroom. I immediately gravitated towards it and very quickly realized that this was an incredible thing that I could use for a variety of purposes. Fast forward a bit later, I ended up going to college, still in California, at Stanford, and I studied something called symbolic systems, which is a mix of computer science with philosophy and linguistics. And this is a very tried and true career path or sort of degree program, albeit a bit of an odd one to explain to my parents, but a very tried and true one for one very specific career trajectory, which is going into technology, staying in Silicon Valley, and sort of harnessing both the sort of sophisticated quantitative skills that I learned and marrying that with sort of the emerging space of tech. And that was my plan. But a funny thing happened along the way. While I was in college, some friends approached me to help start a nonprofit. And this was something they were interested in doing, basically to help kids whose parents have cancer. And that sounded like a great thing, and I'll be perfectly honest with you. I sort of wanted to help them in part because I wanted to learn how you build something from nothing. And I would use that in my future career as a technology entrepreneur. And that actually turned into something called Camp Kesem. It's a camp for kids whose parents have or had cancer. We created the first camp at Stanford in 2001. We served 37 kids and their families. It was a sort of a remarkable success as a camp, and there's now, I'm very proud to say, over 150 camps across the United States, serving thousands and thousands of people, families dealing with cancer. And for me, on a very personal note, it was sort of resulted in sort of a humanitarian awakening and an opportunity to say, well, maybe I should actually think about taking my talents and my interests as effectively a computer geek and marrying that with oncology and seeing what kind of science and what kind of advances I could pursue in that domain. And so fast forward some numbers of years later, I find myself sort of at the forefront of an exciting new space in cancer research. I was and am still a clinician. I see patients every Monday morning on the 11th floor of the Yaki building at Dana-Farber. I was and am still a computer nerd, and I like to write code and solve puzzles using the data from the patients that I treat. And I've been able to merge that with the world of biology as applied to cancer and use this sort of confluence of different spaces together to understand sort of this disease and use it to find new drugs for patients. And in this sense, this field, clinical computational oncology, lets me sample the patients directly. So the patient is my model system that I get to study, the patients I care for. I get to write code and come up with algorithms and figure out ways to sort of solve the puzzles that are inherent in the patients that end up developing cancer, why they become resistant, and so on and so forth, and merge that with cancer biology again and put that right in the middle. And this is sort of the field that I'm in and the space scientifically that I operate in. But it can still feel a little abstract. And I think for the purposes of this presentation, which has a somewhat daunting title, artificial intelligence is itself sort of a daunting sort of set of words, I thought I'd actually zoom it down into a motivating patient that really explains sort of the motivation for why we're doing this. This is actually a patient I started caring for as a first-year medical oncology fellow with Dr. Shueri way back when. I think this was like 2011 or so. This is a patient with metastatic kidney cancer. This is a CT scan, and you don't need to, there's no test, there's no exam at the end of this session, but I'll just want to tell you that this is sort of part of the abdomen, and this big red circle here is encircling something that's not supposed to be there. This is a metastatic deposit from a patient's kidney cancer. This patient had already progressed on, at the time, really the only FDA-approved therapy for these patients at that time, and the life expectancy was 0 to 3 months. We were able to get this patient onto an early phase trial of an emerging cancer immunotherapy, and was very happy to see that this patient achieved a complete and durable response. And this patient effectively has been cured of a metastatic solid tumor, in this case a kidney cancer, which is something that, as a first-year medical oncology fellow, I really had a tough time wrapping my head around, but how truly remarkable that was and how amazing that still is today. So that really also provoked a series of very interesting questions and thoughts I would have about what does this all mean? You know, what is the biology? What are the genomics? What's the explanation for why we see this in some patients and don't see this in others? How do we actually evaluate and figure out who should get these drugs in the clinic? You know, who is this for? And, you know, who is it not for? And how does that all work? And then, in addition, and I think this was really nicely articulated by Goldie earlier in the prior session, how do we make sure we get this for everyone? And so these three questions, sort of why, for whom do we do this, and how, are really at the heart of really all the science we do. And the overarching theme and sort of the question really for this session is whether there's artificial intelligence can actually help promote this and help push this forward across the board. So with that as sort of a backdrop, what I thought I would do is really explain to you a couple of examples of how this motivating patient and this patient's story has prompted some initial forays into using AI for some of these questions, and then I'll end with, you know, some visions of where we want to take this before I open this up for questions. So first, AI for biological discovery. Why? Why does this happen? Why did that exceptional response happen for that patient and not for other patients? What we've done over the last 10 years in the field is basically try to study the genomes of these tumors and sort of scan every part of the genetic code and look for patterns in these genomes and figure out whether there are differences in the patients who respond from those who don't. And that's a question we wanted to apply to this particular patient and the many hundreds and thousands of patients like this patient, where we sequence these patients' genomes, and we wanted to ask which ones respond and which ones don't. There's massive amounts of data that one has to deal with in trying to answer that type of question. And there have been many folks in the field, in the community, who have developed algorithms to try to parse through that data, sift through this huge haystack to find the needle, and it would take me the next 3 or 4 hours to go through all of them in detail, but I'll just say those have worked to a degree, and we have developed and used some of those over the last 10 years ourselves. But increasingly, there's this opportunity to take some of these newer algorithms, these sort of deep learning algorithms that are parts of AI, and place those at the center of this question. Take this huge amounts of genomic data, train these AI algorithms, these deep learning models, these neural networks, these are some terms you may have read about in various domains, have it figure out what are the patterns that discriminate those who respond, like my patient, and those from those who don't, and use that as a way for discovery. But there's one big problem with those kinds of algorithms, or at least one big problem, that are often sort of depicted in these kinds of cartoons, is that those tend to be black boxes. We can't answer why. It can't tell us what was it in the genome that actually explained this particular response. And that leaves those of us sort of on the biological side wanting for more. We're sort of saying, well, that's not really satisfying. We can't intervene upon something we don't understand, and we need to understand why. So we took that actually as a challenge that might even be a challenge that could be solved with some creative computation. And so we took the same concept of neural networks that I just showed you in the prior slide, and instead of sort of leaving it as it was, we engineered biology into the network. So what does that mean? That means instead of each of these little nodes and edges that connect the nodes that are used to train these deep learning models, to train these algorithms, we actually had it model what we know and what has been discovered over the last 100 years of biology to represent genes and how genes are connected to each other to create pathways, and how pathways are connected to create processes. And in doing this, we've engineered sort of all that is known about biology into the architecture of the model, and we can then use this to not only figure out sort of which patients are likely to be different than the others, but also open up the box and figure out why. And in this case, we were able to do this, train the algorithm on the same genomes that I told you about a moment ago, have it figure out which ones are, patients are likely to respond and which ones for patients not likely to respond. Open up the box, discover a new gene we had not expected, but was actually relevant for treating these kinds of patients, that is immediately translated into repurposing a drug that was being tested in a completely unrelated use case into the use cases we cared about, and have launched a phase 1 clinical trial. And we did this without generating a single new genome, but rather collecting all of the data that already exists in this domain. And sort of even in this toy example, demonstrated how we can use biologically informed AI with experimental biology that I'm sort of skipping over for the purposes of this presentation, and take that straight into a clinical trial that we can now do at Dana-Farber. So that's one quick example of AI for biological discovery, AI to help us understand why. But we also need to use AI to figure out for whom, right? And so here's another really exciting place where AI has a major potential impact for patients with cancer. And for this, I'll actually sort of harken back to that picture I showed you before, the CT scan with the big red circle that shows you where the cancer is, and say this is actually a picture. And as it happens in medicine, we have a lot of pictures from a lot of different sources. And this is from radiology pictures, but we also have pathology pictures. When we take tumors out of patients, they get sliced up, and expert pathologists look at them under the microscope. They help us make diagnoses, and they are effectively, as sort of was alluded to earlier in the open session, human intelligence. Humans trained to predict and figure out what kinds of cancers are where and how bad they are, looking at features in a picture. So why am I telling you this in an AI session? Well, outside of cancer, pictures are also being used to drive a lot of the innovation in AI. Think of self-driving cars. That is a picture challenge. The car needs to figure out where the people are, where the other cars are, where the street lights are, and so on and so forth. And these are problems for which many AI algorithms have already been developed and are now being deployed. I was just in San Francisco a couple weekends ago and had a chance to take a self-driving car instead of an Uber on my way to a wedding, sort of to give you an illustration of where that technology is. So how can we take that into cancer? Well, we can take these pictures from our cancer patients, and in this case, this is a kidney cancer, similar to the patient that I described to you earlier. This is a picture of the cancer under the microscope. Train AI algorithms to figure out not just where the cancer is, but what different features there are within the cancer and how those features can actually create more complex but still quantifiable, meaning complex but still things we can measure with numbers and be able to compare across patients. map not just the stuff about the tumor, but also features about the immune cells that surround the tumor, and use combinations of these things to successfully predict which patients are most likely to benefit from that same immunotherapy I described to you earlier. Not from a huge amount of genomics and not from a massive amounts of all sorts of different things, but simply from a picture. That's pretty cool. So I told you about a biology example. I showed you about a clinical implementation example. What about AI safety and equity? How do we actually make this sort of available to everyone? How do we study the problems that could arise with AI? And here, too, our community has really been leading the way in thinking through this. This includes examples from our group, where in our case, we actually took an algorithm that was built by Google and tested it on thousands and thousands of cancer genomes to figure out and demonstrate that it actually worked better for finding some of the events that we care about for patients who are likely to have inherited cancers, sort of like some of the cancers that was alluded to earlier in the earlier session, the folks that Sapna Singhal and others treat in their early intervention programs, and for which we actually were able to report not too long ago in JAMA. And it also means coming up with ways to think about this technology from an ethical perspective, and in this case, engaging with their ethics research program at Dana-Farber, and sort of bringing the ethicists into the fold early and often to make sure that this new technology is developed in a way that's applicable and relevant to everyone. So I hope I've sort of impressed upon you the first sort of bit of this, that we think there's a huge opportunity here to understand why for biological discovery, to figure out for whom for clinical evaluation, and how are we going to give this technology to everyone. But the fun part about this is, and sort of as you can probably imagine, sort of as a computer nerd who accidentally went to medical school, I can sort of recognize that we're just barely scratching the surface of what is possible in this domain, and why this represents such an exciting time, both in the science and in the clinical aspects of what this could mean for cancer patients here and everywhere. So what do I mean? Well, there's a few good examples. So here's one example. You may have heard about some of these things called foundation models. These are things that are being used in lots of other domains and are getting a lot of attention in the press. ChatGPT, DALL-E, DeepMind. I don't know if have folks heard of any of these? I see some noddings of head and raising of hands. Fantastic. Just in case you haven't, I'll give you an example of what this is actually doing. So this is for ChatGPT. Basically, this is an AI algorithm trained on trillions of words and letters and paragraphs and documents and everything you could possibly imagine, that is then sort of used for two kinds of purposes. One, to help you sort of validate things and to help you ask it questions to make sure that there are things that you might know. So here's just one example that I used it for not too long ago, just as out of a curiosity. I asked it a question. I said, what's the initial treatment for grade 3B follicular lymphoma with lymph nodes above and below the diaphragm? This may or may not have been a board renewal question that I was doing in real time. I'm a genital urinary oncologist. I cannot confess to taking care of too many lymphoma patients these days. And sure enough, ChatGPT gave me a very reasonable and thoughtful answer. It also can do some pretty cool things on sort of helping you creatively think through potential unseen concepts. So this is a harder one to sort of wrap your head around, but when you have something trained on trillions and trillions of words, curious things can happen. And there's too many ways to articulate this, but I thought that maybe the most approachable way would be the way I approached it to my wife, who's not in medicine, but my wife is also a former professional tennis player. And so I said, come over here, check this out, this is cool. She's like, why? I don't want to get it. I said, my wife is a tennis player and also a big Britney Spears fan. I said, can you write a song in the style of Britney Spears about the top 5 men's single tennis players? And she's like, sure, okay. And for those of you who've used this thing before, within about half of a second, it just spit out an entire song And it was like dead silence for my wife and just jaw on the floor. Pretty cool, right? So why am I telling you this? Well, in cancer biology, there are certain domains for which we are approaching scenarios where we too have trillions of measurements that we could conceivably secure. So before I showed you some of our genome work, where we're taking tumors and we're studying their genomes as sort of one unit, what now folks at Dana-Farber, ourselves, many others are doing is studying single cells. So sort of taking the tumor, spreading it out, measuring individual cells within the tumor, and measuring lots of different things within those cells. And so you could imagine that creates orders of magnitude more data, which starts to approach, we're not there yet, but it starts to approach the kinds of data that things like ChatGPT was trained on. Which then opens you, if you start to use your imagination, can let you think about all sorts of cool things you could do that would not otherwise be possible and under any circumstances. You can validate existing concepts. So as a postdoctoral fellow with my mentor Levi Garraway when he was still at the Farber, we thought a lot about a signaling pathway in cancer, and you can query this kind of a foundation model for cancer biology and make sure that it actually represents things we expect. In this case, there may be a few drug targets that some folks may recall if you follow the nuance or not. But the far more provocative thing that this could conceivably do is actually help us explore the vast amount of unknown biology, the things that are not in the architecture we already know, which I had told you about earlier, which really only represents 3,000 to 4,000 genes, if I'm being generous, of the 20,000. We don't really know a whole lot about many of the others. We don't even know where to begin with many of the others. And can something complex like this help us come up with new hypotheses that might help inform new drug targets, new ways of thinking about the biology across the board? And that's where we have this potentially profound opportunity for biological discovery, for drug development, and using high-dimensional, very complicated data with these novel AI approaches to completely revolutionize everything we know about cancer. So that's for why. What about for whom? Well, we have an opportunity as an integrated hospital at Dana-Farber to do some really creative things in this domain as well. We could, for instance, take all the genomics we're currently generating from patients and try to match it using algorithms developed by our friends in the data sciences department, Ethan Sarami and others, called MatchMiner, to figure out which trials might be most relevant for a patient based off of their genomic profile. Match that with the information in the electronic health record, where you have little bots sort of constantly trolling the electronic health record to figure out when is a patient ready for a trial, and help doctors find these patients, those that have a match for a trial and actually need the trial, so that information can be given to the doctor in real time, which could rapidly accelerate sort of everything we do about trials and whatnot. This would be pretty cool, and I should say very concretely, this is already happening. We're doing this study now. This is being led by folks listed below: Ethan, Mike Hassett, Ken Keel, and others across multiple departments at Dana-Farber, really across the entire institution. But this too is just the start, right? I showed you before the pictures that were used in that one N of 1 case. Well, couldn't we insert all of those kinds of pictures and radiology information and other kinds of molecular data into these models to make even better versions of these things? And couldn't we then come up with a whole series of clinical trials and clinical contexts to take those trials into, to study every which way AI could matter? That's actually the future, and that's where we could be going as a community. So why, for whom, and then how? How do we make sure that this kind of technology, which has its challenges, and I'm sure that will come up either here, and I'm having dinner with some of you later to talk about some of these things, how do we make sure this matters for everyone? And that's a major responsibility because these kinds of technology really can be complicated. There have already been some pretty challenging issues with these approaches outside of oncology that have already happened and have been reported in the lay press. So how are we at the Farber thinking about tackling this head on? Well, one thing we need to make sure we do is that we need to make sure that the AI we're developing is not trained exclusively on a small set of patients treated at 450 Brookline Avenue. We can harness the Dana-Farber network and invest in collecting information across the entire Farber network that represents a far more diverse spectrum of patients, experiences, populations, rural and urban settings, and so on and so forth, and use this to train algorithms that are more equitable and representative. But it isn't just a local or even a regional problem, it's a national problem, and truly, it's an international problem. And so another thing we could do is actually invest in the similar kinds of collection across the world. We're lucky, sort of in my division, to have a Center for Global Health Equity led by Tim Rebick and Dio Fidelu, amongst others, who are thinking very deeply and have spent years and decades building trust in communities across the globe, largely third world countries, different kinds of healthcare systems. And we could invest in collecting that information in a similar way so that our AI is truly global. And it also means, perhaps a little provocatively, that were we in an opportunity, in a circumstance to be building a brand new hospital, hypothetically, we could make it AI enabled. So what does that mean? Well, that could mean everything from sort of intentionally building in sort of ways of making sure we have sort of constant measurements, so the right kinds of measurements for our patients in real time for care. It could even mean things, and they're sort of maybe a little bit pie in the sky at the moment, but not totally unreasonable, of thinking about our inpatient cell therapy experiences and how do we use combinations of things like AlphaFold for sort of the right kinds of protein engineering along with sort of novel ways of administration to then tailor drugs to patients in a truly personalized way that actually is equipped, that has a hospital actually built to do that. It's on the table. So why, for whom, and how? There's a huge amount of opportunity to do this. And the other cool thing, I should say, is that we at Dana-Farber are at the forefront of leading the charge. One of the most unexpected but joyous privileges I've had really in my career happened just a week ago. I had an opportunity to participate in a Senate briefing that was exclusively focused on AI and cancer. Unfortunately, this was a closed briefing, so we do not have fancy pictures, although thankfully that means I was not on C-SPAN, which was a relief, because that would have been a little bit, perhaps stressful. But over the course of an hour and a half, in an intimate environment, and you can't see them unless you're really good at making the backs of people's heads. Well, first of all, there's me. For a pretty large and really refreshingly bipartisan audience, you can maybe recognize your favorite or not favorite senator amongst the list. We were able to have a frank and honest discussion about cancer and AI, and I'll just say I was the only oncologist in the room. There were folks from Google and folks from Tempus. There were the former NCI director, Ned Sharpless, who also was a former Dana-Farber fellow, was moderating it. But we had some really thoughtful engagement with a lot of the senators in the room who were very keen and recognized the opportunity therein. And in fact, amongst them, Chuck Schumer, who sort of wanted to say, he actually sort of impromptu went up to the podium to say a few words, which I guess is what politicians do, really sort of emphasized that, even from his perspective as somebody who obviously is not an expert in this domain, recognized the opportunity and said, we have to do this. We have to do this in a bipartisan and equitable way, and it's got to be for everyone. And so that's the goal. Biological discovery, all sorts of opportunities. I've kind of given you a little bit of flavor of some of the stuff that's happening. Clinical evaluation and equitable implementation. These are not siloed activities, as you might imagine, and because of the inherent team collaborative spirit of Dana-Farber, we're already thinking as groups on how we do this. This includes folks like myself, Dr. Schwery, Dr. Irizarry, who's in the room. I saw Dr. Kathy Burns, a pathologist, who's the department chair. Bill Lauder, who's a new recruit in data sciences, who actually built and sort of, and then developed and sold his own mammography AI company before coming back to academia, and many others are thinking about how we do this together. Which is to say that Dana-Farber, of course, is uniquely positioned because of all of the things I mentioned to lead in each of these domains and push this as the future technology for the next 10 to 20 years and really revolutionizing care. So in the last few minutes, what do we need? Well, we need a lot of things. Because if I'm being perfectly honest with you, this stuff is hard to do, it's expensive, and it's the kind of thing that, and having just sat through another study section with a grant review panel with my friends at the NCI over in the federal government, it's not the kind of thing that is going to be sort of easily fundable from a traditional means, because we need to do a lot of things. We need to recruit more faculty and staff. We're competing with for-profit industry, Google, Microsoft, and whatnot, and it turns out they have deep pockets and are willing to sort of pay some of the really talented scientists who can do this kind of work a lot of money. And we need to compete with them and bring them into our cancer world. We need to generate that data that I told you earlier to get to trillions and trillions of bits so that we can actually sort of build these models in the right way. And we need to figure out ways to generate compute that can actually handle this information, and so that we're not constantly, as happened to me this morning, getting kicked off of Google's cloud because somebody else, some other like for-profit monster is seeking it out. We needed to invest in more clinical informatics. Or obviously, as you heard with this new collaboration, have both sort of a challenge and an opportunity to revisit all of sort of the clinical informatics that is sort of part of our daily care that actually feeds these models. We need to invest in trialists who actually understand and want to take on the challenge of how to study AI in real life. And we need to figure out ways of investing in the regulation of these things. This sort of came out at the end of our Senate briefing, where it sort of was very clear that the subtext of that entire meeting was, amongst the senators and that whole sea of staffers that came with us, that they don't know what to do with this, and they're afraid to over and under-regulate this thing. And we need to be at the forefront of that and invest in sort of making sure that it is best suited to help our patients. And we need to make sure this is equitable. I sort of alluded to investments in data collection and whatnot in our networks across the globe. It's not cheap, and I think Dr. Glimcher alluded to a study from Chris Lathan, who's a member of Population Sciences, and actually demonstrated that especially for underrepresented minority populations and lower income populations, you need to invest in just sort of boots on the ground and people there to make sure patients stay in the clinics, and that data actually represents something and is meaningful. It's sort of as simple as that in some sense, but that stuff's expensive to do. And then to make sure that the technology that we are developing here is not only useful here. There's surely more things that need to be done, but I hope this is a flavor of the kinds of opportunities, challenges, and needs that we have as we think about sort of how we put this whole puzzle together as a community. So I think I have maybe about 5 minutes. Yes, okay. To open the door for questions. I'll also be here the whole rest of the day. I'm sure other folks in the room will be very happy to talk to you all as well. Thank you for attending. I hope this wasn't too daunting or intimidating for you all. And sincerely, thank you for all you do on behalf of cancer patients here. Appreciate it.
My question is around training the models. So, you're on the Google platform, obviously regulations, compliance. How are you protecting patient data?
It's very important. And so your question is actually, if I can zoom back here and you one bipartisan question or concern that comes up, you can't see my mouse, from these folks, is very similar about patient protection, data privacy, and whatnot. We are very careful in ensuring that we're using sort of secure, compliant platforms for the training of these models to ensure that there is no leakage of personal information, which is of high risk, and that we are sort of following all the best practices. The good news is that we already have faced this challenge in the genomics era, because genomics is, in some sense, identifiable information. There are people who can hack genetic data and sort of reverse engineer it and figure out where you're from if that data is made publicly available. So we need to we basically can borrow those kinds of protections for things like this. That being said, we anticipate there will be a lot of challenges that come with rolling these kinds of technologies out, and which is why I was sort of coming back to the need for investments in effectively next generation informatics and regulation protection to ensure that we sort of keep things as secure as they need to be, and ensure that patient trust, which is paramount, we don't lose. That's a great question.
So how are you thinking about the application of this to early detection and prevention?
Great question. So we have a lot of initial forays and sort of experiments we're doing in this domain. Actually, I have a sort of a looming collaboration with Sapna Singhal, who's also a member of Population Sciences in my division. And so in that, as an example, I mentioned to you earlier the example of pictures, right? So another place where you get pictures is in those colonoscopies that we do for some of our patients with inherited genetic syndromes. That happens every 6 months, and it can be very hard to sort of scale that kind of screening technology and doing all the downstream pathology work on every single possible biopsy and whatnot. And so one thing we're thinking about doing is training some of the same kinds of computer vision algorithms, these AI algorithms, to sort of predict which of these lesions are really likely to be cancerous or even precancerous and which ones are benign, for instance, as an initial toy example in that domain. I think the bigger vision would be that, as the early detection and intervention initiative that you sort of was alluded to earlier today really starts to expand, that we're investing in a lot of the data collection elements so that we can more aggressively intervene and find patients earlier and earlier, perhaps even pre-cancer, pre-diagnosis, and sort of do the right kinds of intervention well in advance of how things usually happen. I think that, again, requires sort of a forward-thinking investment in the proper kinds of data collection over a long period of time to train the algorithms to do that kind of a task, but it's something we're very keen to do and excited to collaborate with Sapna and others on and doing. Pardon? Whoa, we're at time. I'm so sorry. I'm happy to take your question offline. Thank you again. I think we all have to head back over there. It's a privilege. Cheers.